The Civil Rights Movement, Victory and Violation. The violation of African American rights caused by the separate but equal doctrine passed by the Supreme Court in 1896 was a tragedy that took away African American rights through separating the facilities used by African Americans. The triumphant 1950 through 60 civil rights movement caused by the doctrine accomplished equal voting rights, reformed social, political, and economic conditions of African Americans. Rights that were guaranteed to all citizens of the United States when written into the Constitution were taken away from African Americans due to racism from Caucasians that lived in America, more specifically, the South. In many southern states, African Americans were slaves until the passing of the 13th Amendment in 1865. This amendment made it illegal for anyone to be a slave, unless it were a punishment for one committing a crime. However, this amendment came 2 years after the president of the time, President Abraham Lincoln, issued an Emancipation Proclamation stating that all slaves should be let free. Southern states, however, were not happy with this proclamation, so they rebelled and the Civil War began. The war ended with the passing of the 13th Amendment, with the South surrendering to the North. With slavery being abolished, the racism and mistreatment of African Americans did not cease. In fact, Caucasians wanted nothing to do with the African Americans, and for that, they believed it was necessary to separate the two races. The separate but equal doctrine was a doctrine that was adopted into the U.S. constitutional law in 1890. The doctrine was passed because it was believed that separating people based off of race did not violate the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was adopted on July 9, 1868. The amendment states that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. The doctrine guaranteed the equal treatment between African Americans and Caucasians. This meant that as long as the amenities provided for each race was equal to each other, then races could legally be separated. However, equal was very rarely the case. African Americans were forced to live, learn, and work in facilities that were not as up to par as they should have been. The materials and facilities used by African Americans were as nice as people wanted to make them, meaning that whatever money was put into them is what the African Americans got to use. It is imaginable that people were not putting a whole lot of money into these facilities like they were the non-colored facilities. The same issues arose for the education of colored children. Books, teachers, and materials were not held up to the same standards as those placed in a non-colored school.
Schools where African Americans attended were paid less attention than Caucasian schools. African American schools often did not have desks, chairs, and textbooks for all children to use. In addition, the classrooms in which the children were taught frequently had issues that kept children out of the rooms. They did not contain pictures, posters, or textbooks that were up to date with the education being provided for Caucasian students. In fact, they received the textbooks and posters that Caucasian schools were throwing away so they couldn't have newer learning materials. Some African American schools did not even have bathrooms, water, gymnasiums, or playgrounds. The 15th Amendment was another law that was violated by the separate but equal doctrine. The amendment states that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or breached by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. Although African Americans were technically citizens, they were still denied the right to vote due to the doctrine. Because of the separate schools and African Americans not getting the same education as Caucasians, they were not able to pass the tests that were required to pass in order to have the ability to vote. With the Voting Rights Act, the tests that people needed to pass in order to vote were taken away and no longer required. Not only were African Americans and Caucasians separated in schools, they were also separated in the workplace. Jobs offered to African Americans were jobs that did not require a high level of education, thus making the jobs low-paying jobs. Even African Americans were allowed to have high-paying jobs because of the lack of proper education due to the segregation of schools. There would have been no way that the African Americans could have held the job for a longer duration of time. The Civil Rights Movement caused a big change in the way that society treated African Americans and what opportunities they were offered. May 17, 1954 was the day that the U.S. Congress decided that the segregation of schools was unconstitutional. The winning of this case proved that the separate but equal doctrine was never equal to African Americans. After his daughter was not allowed to attend an all-Caucasian school, Oliver Brown sought out to file a lawsuit against the Board of Education of Kansas. His case ended up reaching Supreme Court along with the other cases filed against other school boards. This lawsuit was called the Brown versus Board of Education. Brown argued that the separate but equal doctrine violated the 14th Amendment, and that argument was enough to convince the Supreme Court that separating schools is unconstitutional. This triumphant victory was a huge turning point in American history because it set the path to African Americans gaining equal rights. Although the Brown versus Board of Education desegregated schools, the hate and the unfair treatment of African Americans did not stop. In Voices from the South, a collection of interviews and stories conducted by Betsy Fancher, many African American students state that their school life was not improved right away. However, they did not state that because of their desegregation of schools, African Americans and Caucasians were able to come together and learn how to go to school in unity and peace with each other. Other triumphs, including the passing laws like the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Equal Rights Opportunity Commissions Act of 1972, however, were not easy to obtain. African Americans had to band together and work with each other in order to bring severity of the situation to Congress. The time in which the African Americans came together was called the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was a movement during the 1950s-60s in which African Americans voiced why they deserve equal rights to Caucasians. The movement was in a time and several marches took place, and the result of the movement was African Americans gaining equal rights to Caucasians in terms of reforming social, political, economic conditions, and voting rights.
The Voting Rights Act abolished the test that citizens had to take in order to be able to vote. These tests kept the African Americans from voting because they did not have the simple knowledge needed to pass them. So when the tests were abolished, the African Americans were able to vote without having to jump through any hoops. This was a triumph because it reformed African Americans' political rights. The Selma to Montgomery March sparked the passing of the Voting Rights Act. On March 7, 1965, people outraged by unfair voting rights band together and participated in the Selma March. The march ended up being so dangerous that the president at the time, President Lyndon B. Johnson, signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 on August 6. Another one of the big changes in the world after the Civil Rights Movement was the enforcement of the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, which made it legal to hire based solely on race, skin color, religion, and gender. This was very important for the African Americans because it gave them the opportunity to get more jobs, and they were able to work in environments they hadn't been able to previously work in. This act gave African Americans the ability to finally feel worthy and not dehumanized by their Caucasian counterparts, thus reforming both social and economic rights of African Americans. African Americans gained rights through the movement, and they became successful because of determination and support. Martin Luther King Jr. helped start most of the movements and protests that happened to gain the Voting Rights Act that was passed. This gave African American more rights in the community because of speakers and protests that were made.
The Selma March is a march in the South where 54 miles of route was protested by African Americans that wanted their rights to vote. Martin Luther King Jr. brought awareness to have the African Americans voting laws during the Selma March. That August, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, which guaranteed the right to vote to all African Americans. The Voting Rights Act made it so African Americans could have more rights and responsibilities in their community and throughout the South. Martin Luther King Jr. is a prime example of a speaker who inspired many marches and protests to help gain the community's equal rights. The marches sparked people to fight for what they believed in because eventually they, too, could accomplish the goals they had. African Americans were not automatically accepted into society because the community still looked down upon them. However, the marches and speeches that were held by the African American community helped them get their rights back. Since the Civil Rights Movement and all the laws that have been passed, all races, including African Americans, have the same rights as Caucasians. African Americans fought long and hard in order to gain equal rights to their counterparts. With acts like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Equal Employment Opportunities Commissions, and the Voting Rights Act, African Americans were able to live freely and not have limitations based on their skin color.